The autumn rain fell upon Ashworth Hall like a lament, each drop striking the weathered stone with the patience of grief long practiced, and within those crumbling walls, Lady Eleanor Ashworth knelt in the garden her mother had planted 20 years before, her fingers deep in soil that had grown cold and unyielding with neglect. The roses had died first, then the lavender, then the delicate climbing jasmine that once perfumed her childhood summers, and now only the hardiest weeds remained, pushing through the earth with a determination Eleanor both envied and despised. She was 24 years old, and she could not remember the last time something in this house had flourished rather than faded. Behind her, the manor rose like a hollow monument to better days. Windows that had once blazed with candlelight now stood dark and accusing, their curtains drawn against creditors and curious neighbors alike. The chandeliers had been sold last winter, the paintings the winter before that, and Eleanor had grown accustomed to walking through rooms that bore the ghost marks of absent frames, pale rectangles on wallpaper that testified to what had been lost. Her father, Lord Ashworth, had begun with the silver, then the horses, then her mother's jewelry, and Eleanor had watched each departure with the numb resignation of someone who understood that sentiment held no currency in a house built on debt. She heard voices drifting from her father's study, the window cracked open despite the chill, as it always was when he entertained his particular breed of visitor, and she stilled her hands in the dirt, listening with the instinct of a creature who had learned to sense danger in the shifting of tones. A man's voice, unfamiliar and smooth as oiled silk, spoke of arrangements and settlements and a most generous solution, and her father's voice, thin and desperate and hatefully grateful, agreed to everything without pause. "The girl will do nicely," the stranger said, and Eleanor felt the words land upon her skin like the first frost of winter, freezing her from the outside in. "She has her mother's beauty, I'm told, and beauty is always negotiable." Her father murmured something about duty and family honor, words that tasted of ash even from this distance, and Eleanor rose slowly from the garden bed, her hands trembling as she brushed the soil from her skirts. She walked to the study door without knowing she had decided to move, her heart a trapped bird throwing itself against her ribs, and she pressed her ear to the wood just as the stranger spoke again. "Then we are agreed. 1 month hence, she becomes my bride, and your debts are forgiven in full." The door opened before Eleanor could flee, and her father stood before her with eyes that could not meet her own, and in that moment she understood with terrible clarity that she had always been the final asset, the last beautiful thing in a house stripped of beauty, and that her father had simply been waiting for the right price. The stranger had gone by the time Eleanor gathered enough of her shattered composure to enter the study, leaving behind only the lingering scent of expensive tobacco and the particular stillness that follows a transaction completed. And her father stood by the window with his back to her, his shoulders hunched beneath the weight of what he had done, though not, she suspected, from remorse. "Lord Marcus Blackwood," he said before she could speak, as though the name itself were explanation enough, and perhaps to him it was the Blackwoods commanded half the county, owned 3 of the finest estates in England, and moved through society with the careless grace of those who had never known want. "You have sold me," Eleanor said, and her voice emerged steadier than she had expected, flat and cold as the autumn rain still streaking the windows, and her father flinched but did not turn, could not turn, would not meet her eyes because he knew what he would find in them. "I have saved this family," he replied, and the words were rehearsed, she could tell, practiced in the mirror perhaps, or whispered to himself in the dark hours when conscience stirred briefly before being drowned in brandy. "Marcus holds my debts, considerable debts, Eleanor. You cannot imagine, and he has offered a solution that benefits us all." She laughed then, a broken sound that startled them both, because the idea that her destruction could be dressed in the language of mutual benefit struck her as the cruelest joke of all. "Lord Marcus Blackwood," she repeated, and now her voice did tremble, because she had heard the stories that circulated through drawing-rooms, in hushed whispers, tales of servants dismissed without reference, of a young woman from the village who had caught his eye one summer and spent the next winter in a sanatorium, of beautiful things he acquired only to watch them shatter beneath his particular attention. "They call him the collector of broken wings. Father, did you know that? Because he finds creatures that still have the capacity to fly and takes such pleasure in ensuring they never will again." Her father turned at last, and she saw in his face not the guilt she had hoped for, but something worse: relief. The desperate relief of a drowning man who has found a piece of driftwood and cannot afford to question whether it will hold. 1 month, he said. The wedding is set for 1 month hence, and you will go to Blackwood Manor to prepare, as is customary, and you will be gracious. Eleanor, you will be everything a bride should be, because our survival depends upon it. She wanted to scream, to rage, to overturn his desk and scatter his papers, and force him to see what he had done, but instead she heard herself ask, quiet as a prayer for the already damned, "And what of the brother the Duke? Does he know his family name is being used to purchase ruined gentlemen's daughters?" Her father's expression flickered with something unreadable: fear, perhaps, or simply the discomfort of acknowledging what he did not wish to examine. The Duke is a recluse, a ghost in his own house, scarred beyond recognition and mad with it. They say he hasn't shown his face in 5 years and likely never will again. So what the Duke knows or does not know is of no consequence to anyone. Eleanor said nothing more, because there was nothing left to say, and she walked from the study with the measured steps of a woman proceeding toward the gallows, already calculating the 30 days remaining to her, and finding, to her distant surprise, that she was not yet ready to surrender entirely to despair. The days that followed moved with the strange elasticity of time experienced under sentence, each hour stretching into its own small eternity, while the weeks themselves seemed to collapse and compress, and Eleanor found herself haunting the forgotten corners of Ashworth Hall in search of something she could not name: answers, perhaps, or simply the illusion of agency in a life that had ceased to belong to her. She began with the servants, those quiet witnesses to a family's unraveling, and discovered that they spoke more freely to a daughter already marked for departure, as though her impending exile had rendered her harmless enough to trust with whispered confidences. It was Mrs. Pemberton, the aging housekeeper who had served 3 generations of Ashworths, who first told her the full story of the Blackwood fire, how it had erupted in the East Wing on a January night 5 years past, how the flames had consumed priceless tapestries and irreplaceable portraits, and very nearly consumed 6 servants trapped in the upper floors, and how Gabriel Blackwood, then a young Duke of 28, had refused to flee until every last soul was accounted for, returning again and again into that inferno until the ceiling finally betrayed him and brought burning timbers down upon the right side of his face. "They say he was beautiful before, Mrs." Pemberton murmured, her weathered hands busy with mending that did not require her attention. The handsomer of the 2 brothers by far, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's bearing, the sort of young lord who set hearts fluttering in every drawing-room from here to London, but he has not shown that face, such as it is now, to anyone outside his household since the surgeons finished their work, and some say the scars drove him to madness, while others say he was always too gentle for this world and simply found his excuse to leave it. Eleanor retreated to her mother's morning-room, the one space her father had not, yet stripped of its contents, perhaps from sentiment, or perhaps merely from oversight. And there she unearthed old society pages and correspondence that painted a portrait of the man who dwelt in shadows. Gabriel Blackwood, patron of the arts, collector of rare botanical specimens, rumoured to have travelled extensively through Europe and beyond, described in one breathless account as possessing a mind of unusual depth and a manner of uncommon kindness. She read until the candles guttered and her eyes ached, and then she sat in the darkness and allowed herself to feel the first stirring of something that was not quite hope, but was, at least, a cousin to curiosity. That night, by the light of a single taper, she opened her journal and wrote words she would never speak aloud. "I am promised to a monster who wears beauty like a mask, and somewhere in that same house lives a man who has hidden himself away because fire stole the face the world valued, and yet everything I have read suggests that the scarred brother possesses the soul I would choose, were choosing permitted to women such as I, and the handsome brother possesses only appetite and cruelty dressed in fine clothes." She paused, her pen hovering, and then added with a fierce and private defiance, "Perhaps the world has confused which brother is truly the beast." The carriage wheels had scarcely ceased their turning upon the gravel drive before Eleanor understood that Blackwood Manor was not merely a house, but a living monument to contradiction, a sprawling testament to the war between light and shadow that seemed to define everything the Blackwood name touched. And as she stepped down from the carriage into the pale October afternoon, she found herself standing before a structure that appeared to exist in two separate worlds, simultaneously the western wing rising in magnificent splendor, its windows gleaming with fresh glass, and its stonework scrubbed clean of centuries' accumulated soot, while the eastern wing loomed dark and silent as a held breath, its windows shuttered, or perhaps merely black with neglect, its ivy growing unchecked in a wild embrace that spoke of years without the touch of gardener's shears. And between these two halves stood the central entrance like a border crossing between kingdoms that had long ago ceased diplomatic relations. Marcus Blackwood emerged from the gleaming doors with the practiced grace of a man who understood precisely how to arrange his features into an expression of welcome, while his eyes communicated something else entirely, and Eleanor noted how the servants who flanked him stood with the particular stillness of those who have learned that sudden movements invite unwanted attention, how their gazes remained fixed on middle distances, as though they had trained themselves not to see what transpired before them. "Lady Eleanor," Marcus said, and her name in his mouth sounded like a possession already claimed, "how delightful that you've arrived safely. I trust the journey from your charming little estate was not too taxing, though I imagine any journey away from such reduced circumstances. He must feel like liberation of a sort," and his smile curved with the satisfaction of a man who understood he had landed his blow precisely where intended, in the soft place where pride still struggled against the armor of necessity. She curtsied with mechanical precision, murmuring appropriate responses while her eyes catalogued every detail of her gilded prison. The fresh flowers in the entrance hall that cost more than her father's quarterly income, the servants in livery so fine it mocked her travelling dress with its carefully mended seams, and always, the dark wing visible through windows and doorways that shadowed half of the house that servants' eyes slid past as though it did not exist at all. Her rooms were beautiful in the way of museum pieces, preserved and perfect and utterly without warmth, and Eleanor moved through the rituals of arrival, the unpacking she was not permitted to assist with, the tour she was not permitted to decline, the dinner she was not permitted to escape, with the serene countenance of a woman who had already begun to separate her outer self from whatever remained within that still belonged to her alone. It was nearly midnight when sleep proved impossible, when the walls of her exquisite chamber pressed close as coffin sides, and she found herself drawn to the window by some instinct she could not name, parting the heavy curtains to gaze out upon the moonlit gardens below, and there, moving between the silver-touched hedgerows with a grace that seemed almost supernatural, walked a cloaked figure whose face remained hidden in shadow, and as Eleanor pressed her palm against the cold glass, the figure paused as though sensing observation, turned slowly toward her window, and stood motionless for one eternal moment before dissolving into the darkness of the forbidden wing, like smoke dispersing on an autumn wind. 3 nights she endured within those beautiful, suffocating walls before the restlessness grew teeth and claws and drove her from her bed into the darkened corridors of Blackwood Manor, her bare feet silent upon cold marble as she moved through the sleeping house like a ghost, already practicing for the death of self that marriage to Marcus would surely bring, and she found herself drawn inexorably toward the forbidden wing that shadowed half of the estate, that servants' eyes slid past and voices never mentioned, as though some magnetic force emanated from its darkness and called to something equally dark within her own breast. The door she discovered was not locked, which seemed to her less an oversight than an invitation, and she pressed her palm against the ancient wood and felt it yield beneath her touch with the whispered sigh of hinges too long undisturbed. And beyond lay not the cobwebbed abandonment she had expected, but a corridor that, while unlit by sconce or candle, nevertheless bore the unmistakable signs of habitation, floors free of dust, walls lined with paintings whose subjects she could not discern in the darkness, and at its end, a soft amber glow that beckoned like a lighthouse, glimpsed through storm. The library she entered was vast and beautiful in the particular way of spaces that have been loved rather than merely maintained, its shelves climbing toward shadows that swallowed the ceiling, its furniture worn to comfortable softness by years of use, its air perfumed with leather and paper, and the dying remnants of a fire that still glowed ember-red in an enormous hearth. And Eleanor stood in its center, turning slowly, as though she had stumbled into a cathedral of words, and found herself moved to worship until a voice emerged from the darkness beyond the firelight, deep and cultured, and carrying within its timbre a gentleness so unexpected that she startled and nearly fled. "The door was unlocked," she said, which was not an apology but perhaps an explanation, and the voice responded with what might have been amusement. "It is always unlocked. Few possess the courage or the curiosity to test it," and she could see nothing of him. This speaker in shadows could perceive only a suggestion of height and breadth, where the darkness gathered most densely in a chair, angled away from the fire's revealing light. And something about his concealment calmed rather than frightened her, as though she had found a fellow creature who understood the necessity of hiding. Their conversation unfolded with the careful precision of two people unused to company, each question a small offering, each answer a calculated risk, and when he asked why she wandered sleepless through a house that was not her own, she found herself answering with a truthfulness that surprised her. "I cannot bear lying still in the dark, knowing what awaits me in the light," and when he asked what she feared most about the fate that had been chosen for her, she was silent for a long moment before the words emerged from some unguarded depth. "Not pain, I have survived pain, but emptiness, the slow hollowing of everything I am until nothing remains but the shape he wishes to fill," and the silence that followed her confession stretched so long she thought he would not respond at all, until finally his voice came again, softer now, and threaded through with something that sounded almost like recognition. "Then, we fear the same thing, you and I, to exist without truly living, to endure without purpose, to become merely the space between heartbeats rather than the heart itself." The days that followed wore masks of civility while concealing teeth, each morning bringing a new performance of courtship that Eleanor learned to endure, with the practiced stillness of a woman who understood that survival sometimes required the abandonment of authentic expression, and Marcus played his role with the consummate skill of a man who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of appearing human in the presence of witnesses. He brought her flowers that she knew he had ordered a servant to select, spoke pretty words that carried the hollow ring of lines rehearsed before a mirror, and smiled for the society visitors who called to inspect the future bride, with the warm charm of a host who understood that reputation was merely another currency to be spent and hoarded as strategy required. But in the private hours, when the last carriage had departed and the servants had retreated to their quarters, with the particular haste of those who preferred not to witness what transpired in empty corridors, Marcus shed his pleasant mask with the casual ease of a man removing a coat grown too warm, and Eleanor discovered that cruelty, like water, would always find its way through the smallest cracks in any defense she might construct. A comment about her shabby trousseau delivered with a smile that never reached his eyes, a criticism of her conversation that left her questioning whether she had ever possessed wit at all, a casual observation about the servants from her family's estate who would surely need to be dismissed once she learned proper standards. It was on the 5th day that she witnessed what she had previously only intuited, standing frozen in an alcove off the main corridor, when Marcus's voice rose sharp as a blade from the room beyond, and through the half-open door she watched him strike a young footman across the face for the crime of having spilled a single drop of wine upon the tablecloth, watched the boy crumple not from the force of the blow, but from the weight of understanding that there would be no consequence, no recourse, no justice in this house of beautiful things and ugly truths. And when Eleanor stepped forward without conscious thought, her voice steady despite the trembling that had seized her hands, saying only, "That was unnecessary," Marcus turned to her with an expression of such cold surprise that she understood she had committed an error whose price would soon come due. He crossed the space between them in 3 strides that seemed to devour distance itself, and his hand closed around her wrist with a pressure that bypassed pain and spoke directly to the bone beneath, and he lowered his face close to hers with a smile that belonged in nightmares as he whispered, "You will learn your place before the wedding, my dear, or I will teach you, and I am not a patient instructor." That night she returned to the library with bruises blooming purple beneath her sleeve, and she did not speak at first, merely stood before the dying fire and let the silence stretch between herself and the shadow in the chair until his voice emerged, softer than she had yet heard it. "You are different tonight," and when she reached for a book upon a high shelf, her sleeve fell back and the firelight found the marks upon her skin, and the sound he made was not quite human, a sharp intake of breath that transformed midway into something low and dangerous, a growl that seemed to emerge from the same primal place where protective instincts lived, alongside rage, and his voice, when it came again, had edges sharp enough to cut. "Who did this to you?" But Eleanor found she could not answer, found that the words had lodged themselves somewhere behind her breastbone, alongside the shame of having been so publicly claimed as property that could be damaged at the owner's discretion, and her silence told him everything her voice could not. And in the darkness beyond the firelight, she heard him rise from his chair for the first time, heard his footsteps halt just at the edge of shadow, and his voice emerged rough with an emotion she recognized as kindred to her own suppressed fury. "He will answer for this. I swear to you upon whatever remains of my honor, he will answer." After that night in the library, when his voice had carried the weight of an oath sworn upon the altar of righteous fury, Gabriel began to appear in the moonlit garden, where Eleanor had first glimpsed his cloaked figure, moving through silver-touched shadows, and though he still kept himself positioned where darkness could embrace the damaged half of his face, he no longer retreated when she drew near, no longer fell silent when their conversations drifted toward territories more intimate than literature or philosophy. He spoke to her of poetry now, reciting verses that seemed to have been written specifically for moonlit gardens and impossible circumstances, his voice wrapping around the words of Byron and Shelley and Keats, until they became not merely poems but confessions disguised as art. And she found herself sharing secrets she had never spoken aloud, the dreams she had harbored as a girl of 17, before her mother's death and her father's descent into the comforting oblivion of gambling halls, dreams of studying the great botanical gardens of Europe, of pressing flowers between the pages of scientific journals, of belonging to herself and to her work, rather than to the highest bidder in the marriage market her father had made of her life. "Tell me about Venice," she asked one night, when the moon hung heavy and golden above the sleeping roses, and his voice softened into something almost reverent as he described the way morning light transformed the canals into ribbons of molten gold, the way music drifted from open windows at midnight, the way the entire city seemed to float between water and sky like a dream that refused to acknowledge the existence of solid ground. And she closed her eyes and saw it all through his words, saw Paris in autumn, with leaves carpeting the Tuileries, saw the Alps rising white and eternal against skies so blue they hurt to remember, saw the world that existed beyond the walls of her father's crumbling estate and the gilded prison of Blackwood Manor. And when she opened her eyes again, they were bright with tears she refused to let fall. "Why do you not simply run?" he asked, and in his voice she heard not judgment but genuine bewilderment, the confusion of a man who possessed the means to go anywhere and could not comprehend the particular paralysis of powerlessness, and she laughed a sound without humor, brittle as winter branches, before answering with the truth that governed every breath she took within these walls. "Where would I go, Gabriel? A woman with nothing, no money, no connections, willing to defy a man like Marcus. No skills that society deems valuable belongs to whoever claims her. And if I run, I become not free but merely unclaimed, which is another word for prey." The silence that followed her words stretched long enough that she thought she had finally succeeded in driving him away with the ugliness of her reality. But when his voice emerged again from the shadows, it was rough with an emotion she could not immediately name, cracked down the center like a heart learning too late what it should have understood all along. "You belong to no one but yourself, Eleanor, not to your father who sold you, not to my brother who bought you, not to the society that would condemn you for daring to want more than a decorative existence. You belong to yourself, and anyone who tells you otherwise is merely trying to steal what they could never deserve." She discovered the greenhouse by accident on a morning when Marcus had ridden out to meet with creditors, and the manor seemed to exhale in his absence, its corridors losing that particular tension that accompanied his presence like an unpleasant perfume, and Eleanor had wandered farther into the dark wing than she had previously dared in daylight, following a path through an overgrown courtyard where weeds had conquered the cobblestones and nature was slowly reclaiming what architecture had borrowed, until she came upon a structure of glass and iron that rose from the neglected grounds like a secret whispered between the earth and sky. The panes were clouded with age and climbing vines, but through them she could see impossible colors, the green of thriving things, the jeweled tones of flowers that had no business blooming in such apparent abandonment, and her heart recognized it before her mind could name it. A sanctuary, a hidden Eden, a place where beauty had been permitted to exist without apology or audience. She found the door unlocked, as if it had been waiting for her, and stepped inside to find herself surrounded by orchids of every conceivable variety, their delicate faces turned toward the light that filtered through the glass, like pilgrims oriented toward prayer, and roses climbing trellises, in shades from deepest crimson to palest blush, and ferns unfurling their prehistoric spirals alongside plants she had only ever seen in botanical illustrations, specimens that must have been collected from the far corners of the world and somehow coaxed to flourish in this unlikely cathedral of glass and growing things. And there, at the center of it all, with his back to her and his hands buried in dark soil, knelt Gabriel, so absorbed in his work that he did not hear her approach until her foot found a loose stone and sent it skittering across the floor. He froze as if the sound had turned him to marble, and she watched the tension climb his spine vertebra by vertebra, watched his shoulders rise with the particular defensiveness of a man preparing for rejection, and when he finally turned, it was with the slow reluctance of someone unveiling a wound they knew would inspire revulsion. And she saw him, truly saw him, in the unforgiving honesty of daylight for the first time. The left side of his face, as beautiful as any portrait of aristocratic breeding, all clean lines and classical proportions, and the right side transformed by fire into a landscape of raised scars and mottled skin that told the story of flames that had loved him too well, had tried to consume him, and settled for marking him as their own instead. And his eyes, God, his eyes held such resigned anticipation of her horror, such weary certainty that this moment would be the end of whatever fragile connection they had built in shadows and moonlight, that she felt something crack open in her chest that might have been her heart, making room for more feeling than she had known it could contain. She did not step back, she stepped forward, crossing the space between them until she stood close enough to see the way his breath had stopped, the way hope and fear warred behind his gaze, and she looked past him to the riot of blooming life that surrounded them both before returning her attention to his face, to all of his face, equally with the same wonder, and asked, "You grew all of this yourself?" and watched his lips part around words that would not come, watched confusion slowly replace the anticipated rejection as she reached out to touch the velvet petal of a nearby orchid with the reverence it deserved, adding softly, "Beauty thriving in hiding, you have created something extraordinary here, Gabriel." His eyes filled with something luminous and fragile, something that looked like the first light of dawn breaking over a landscape that had known only darkness, and she understood that no one had looked at him truly looked, without flinching, without the performative pity that was merely disgust wearing a mask in 5 years of exile, and she understood too that she was seeing him now as perhaps no one ever had, not the Duke, not the recluse, not the monster his brother had tried to make him, but simply a man who had built a garden in his loneliness and tended it with the love he had no one else to give it to, until now. They sat together among the orchids as the afternoon light painted shifting patterns through the clouded glass above them, and Eleanor waited while Gabriel gathered words that seemed to cost him more than any poem he had ever recited, more than any confession whispered in moonlit gardens, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the particular heaviness of truths, too long carried in silence. "The fire was not an accident," he said, and the words fell between them like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples outward that would change the shape of everything she thought she understood about this family, this house, the man she was promised to marry, and she listened without breathing as he continued, his hands still dark with soil, his eyes fixed on some middle distance where memory lived like a wound that refused to heal. Marcus said it deliberately, drunkenly, with the particular viciousness of a man who has just learned that the world will not arrange itself according to his desires. "Our father had announced that evening at dinner that I would inherit everything, the title, the estates, the fortune, all of it held in trust for the eldest son, as tradition demanded. And Marcus had somehow convinced himself that father would break with centuries of precedent for him, that charm and social grace would outweigh birthright, and Gabriel's laugh held no humor, only the hollow echo of old grief. He waited until the household slept and set fire to the east wing, where my chambers were located, where 6 servants also slept in the rooms above the kitchens, and I woke to screaming and smoke so thick it seemed solid, and I did not think. I simply moved, door to door, pulling people from their beds, carrying a scullery maid down a staircase that was already beginning to collapse, going back again and again until everyone was out, and on the final trip the ceiling came down, and his hand rose unconsciously to touch the scarred side of his face, a gesture so habitual it seemed involuntary. I survived, obviously, though the doctors expressed surprise at this development for several weeks afterward, and Marcus expressed the appropriate shock and horror, played the devoted brother at my bedside, and I never told anyone what I had seen through the smoke, his face in the window of the opposite wing, watching, waiting to see if his problem would solve itself in flames. Eleanor's hands had found his without her conscious decision, her fingers threading through his soil-stained ones as if she could anchor him to the present moment, pull him back from the burning corridors of memory. And she understood now the full weight of what lived between these brothers, not mere rivalry, but something darker, something that had roots in attempted murder and flourished in the silence Gabriel had maintained for 5 years. Father died 3 months later, Gabriel continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. His heart, the doctors said, though I believe it was simply that he could not bear what his family had become, and I was so disgusted, so horrified by what Marcus had done, and so ashamed of my own inability to speak of it, that I retreated here, let him have the social position he craved, told myself that isolation was what I deserved for failing to stop him, for failing to be the kind of man who could look his brother in the eye and name him monster. And here his voice cracked, fracturing along fault lines of guilt she could see had been forming for half a decade. And every person he has hurt since that day, every servant struck, every debt manipulated, every cruelty large and small, that weight is mine too, Eleanor, because I had the power to stop him and chose instead to hide among my flowers and pretend the world beyond these glass walls did not exist. The weeks that followed unfurled like the slow opening of one of Gabriel's rare night-blooming orchids, each day bringing new petals of intimacy and understanding that neither of them had dared to hope for in their separate isolations, and Eleanor found herself marking time not by the approaching wedding that loomed like a storm on the horizon, but by the stolen hours she gathered with Gabriel, like precious stones to be hoarded against the coming darkness, mornings in the greenhouse, where he taught her the delicate art of grafting roses, his hands guiding hers with a tenderness that made her breath catch, as he showed her how to join two living things into something new and stronger than either had been alone. Afternoons in the library, where she read aloud from volumes of poetry while he sat in the chair opposite and watched her with eyes that held the particular wonder of a man who had forgotten that such simple pleasures existed. Evenings in the moonlit garden where their walks had evolved from careful distances to fingers intertwined to his arm around her waist, as naturally as if they had been doing this for years rather than weeks, and she laughed, truly laughed, the sound surprising her with its freedom. The first time he made a dry observation about the pretensions of society, portraiture, and he had stopped walking and turned to her with an expression of such unguarded joy that she asked what was wrong, and he had said, his voice rough with emotion, "You sound like spring arriving after an endless winter," and she had understood then that she was not the only one being slowly brought back to life by these clandestine hours. Marcus noticed, of course, because cruelty sharpens certain instincts even as it dulls others, and he cornered her one afternoon in the hallway outside her chambers, his handsome face arranged in that particular smile that preceded his worst moments, asking with silken menace why his intended bride seemed so content when she had arrived at Blackwood Manor, looking like a woman walking toward the gallows. And Eleanor had felt the familiar ice of fear crystallize in her chest, but forced her voice to steadiness as she replied that she had simply accepted her fate, that fighting the inevitable only exhausted the spirit, and wasn't acceptance the proper wifely virtue he should wish to cultivate in her. And Marcus had studied her face for a long moment, with eyes that calculated and weighed and sought for cracks in her performance, before finally smiling his satisfaction at what he believed was her submission, her breaking, the dimming of that proud light he had been so eager to extinguish, and he had released her with a casual cruelty, a dismissive wave, utterly convinced of his victory. That night she wept in Gabriel's arms in the darkened greenhouse, surrounded by flowers that asked nothing of her, and he held her without words, without false promises that everything would somehow be well, without the comfortable lies that would have been so easy to offer and so hollow to receive. And when her sobs had quieted to trembling breaths, he pressed his lips to her hair and said simply, "You are not alone, whatever comes, whatever we must face. You are not alone anymore." And Eleanor understood that this was the only promise he could make honestly, and that it was, Somehow, enough, more than enough, it was everything. 3 days before the wedding, when autumn had stripped the garden to its bones, and the moon hung swollen and silver above Blackwood Manor like a witness waiting to testify, Gabriel found Eleanor standing among the skeletal roses, with her face tilted upward toward that cold light, tears tracking silent paths down her cheeks that gleamed like liquid mercury in the darkness, and he did not approach from the shadows, as he had done so many times before, did not keep the ruined half of his face hidden in the merciful dark, but instead stepped fully into the moonlight, where every scar, every ridge of damaged flesh, every mark of the fire his brother had set, was illuminated with brutal clarity, and when she turned at the sound of his footsteps, her breath caught not at the sight of his wounds, but at the expression in his eyes. Something had broken open in him, some wall he had maintained even through their most intimate conversations, and what poured through the breach was raw and terrible and beautiful in its desperate honesty, as he spoke words that seemed to have been building pressure in his chest for weeks, perhaps for years. "I cannot let you marry him," he said, and his voice carried the weight of a man, finally setting down a burden he had carried until his spine curved with it. "I will not stand in my shadows and watch you walk into that church and bind yourself to a monster I could have stopped, should have stopped, a monster I enabled with my cowardice and my shame and my pathetic conviction that hiding was somehow noble rather than simply easier than facing the world that would stare at my face and see only wreckage." Eleanor turned fully toward him, the tears still wet on her cheeks, and her voice when she spoke held an edge he had not heard before, a blade of anger beneath the grief. "You are the Duke. Gabriel, you have been the Duke all along, with all the power and authority that title carries, and you could have stopped this at any moment, could have refused to allow your brother to barter for a bride using debts incurred in your family's name, could have stepped out of your greenhouse and your library and your midnight gardens and simply said no, and instead you watched and waited, but he was nodding, accepting every word like blows he had earned, and when she faltered, he finished for her. "And I was a coward, yes, I know. I have catalogued my failures every night for 5 years, and added new ones each morning. I thought I deserved my exile, my isolation. I thought the fire had burned away whatever right I had to participate in the living world. But watching him court you with his cold cruelty, watching the light in your eyes dim when he entered a room, watching you prepare to sacrifice yourself on the altar of my inaction," and here his voice cracked, fractured along lines of pain he had never before allowed anyone to witness. "I love you, Eleanor. I love you with every scarred and broken piece of myself, and I cannot be silent any longer, cannot watch from the darkness while the only bright thing in my world is extinguished." She crossed the distance between them in 3 steps, her hands rising to cup his face both sides equally, the smooth and the ruined, her palms warm against flesh that had not known gentle touch in half a decade, and she kissed his scarred cheek first, pressing her lips to the ridged terrain of old burns, with a tenderness that broke something loose in his chest, and then she kissed his mouth, and the garden around them seemed to hold its breath as two people who had believed themselves beyond saving found in each other the courage to reach for something more than survival. They planned through the remaining hours of darkness, huddled together in the greenhouse where the orchids seemed to lean toward them like conspirators, and the glass walls held back the cold autumn wind that had begun to strip the last leaves from the garden beyond, and Gabriel spread documents across the potting table, ledgers and contracts and correspondence he had quietly gathered over the years, evidence of Marcus's financial manipulations that he had collected, not with any intention of using, but simply because some part of him had always known this reckoning would come, had always understood that his brother's cruelty would eventually demand an answer he could no longer refuse to give. "The debt arrangement," he explained, while Eleanor traced the columns of figures with fingers that trembled only slightly, had never been legally binding, because Marcus had forged Gabriel's signature on the family accounts, had presented himself to creditors and desperate men like Lord Ashworth as acting with ducal authority he did not possess, and this meant that Gabriel could invoke his true position to nullify the entire engagement, could declare the contract void, and Eleanor free, without any obligation being owed by anyone to anyone. But Eleanor understood, as Gabriel's voice grew heavier with each word, that legal technicalities were only part of the battlefield they would need to cross Because Marcus had spent 5 years cultivating powerful friends who benefited from his schemes, men who would not appreciate having their arrangements disrupted, and scandal in society was a weapon that cut the innocent far more deeply than the guilty. Her father's remaining reputation, her own name, the whispered speculation that would follow her through every drawing room and social gathering for the rest of her days if this confrontation became public spectacle. "We offer him an alternative first," Gabriel said, and his jaw tightened with the effort of extending any mercy toward the brother who had tried to murder him. "A private settlement money, enough to establish himself comfortably on the continent, in exchange for releasing you willingly and disappearing from both our lives without the exposure of his crimes." Eleanor studied his face in the grey pre-dawn light that was beginning to seep through the glass panels above. Them, reading the conflict written there, the part of him that still remembered the boy Marcus had been, before bitterness and jealousy had curdled into something monstrous, the part that wished there was some other way, and the newer, fiercer part that would burn the world to ash before allowing her to speak wedding vows to a man who had already bruised her wrist and would surely break far more than that once the church doors closed behind them. "And if he refuses?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Gabriel's hand closed over hers with a grip that promised everything. "Then I stop the wedding publicly, before the altar, before God and every gossip in society, and damn the consequences, I will not let you be sacrificed on the altar of my cowardice twice." She lifted their joined hands and pressed her lips to his scarred knuckles, tasting salt from tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. "Whatever comes," she said, and her voice held steady as stone, "we face it together." He echoed the word like a prayer, like a vow more binding than any ceremony could make. Together. The confrontation took place in Marcus's private study, a room that reeked of expensive tobacco and cheaper ambition, where portraits of Blackwood ancestors lined the walls like silent judges and the fire burned too hot, as if Marcus needed constant reminder of his greatest failure. And Gabriel stood before his younger brother for the first time in 5 years with nothing hidden, no shadows to soften the ruin of his face, no careful angles to spare Marcus the sight of what his drunken rage had wrought, and he watched something flicker in Marcus's eyes, not guilt, never guilt, but a kind of fascinated revulsion, the way one might regard an insect that had survived being crushed before that handsome face, smoothed into the cold charm that had fooled society for so long. "Brother," Marcus said, the word a mockery. "How touching that you finally emerged from your crypt, though I confess the timing seems rather pointed come to wish me well on my upcoming nuptials." Gabriel laid out his offer in precise, measured terms, a sum large enough to establish Marcus comfortably anywhere in Europe, debts cleared, reputation intact, in exchange for releasing Eleanor from the engagement and disappearing from English society permanently. But even as the words left his mouth, he watched Marcus's smile widen into something that belonged on a predator scenting wounded prey, and he knew, had perhaps always known, that this conversation would not end in negotiation. "Keep your money," Marcus laughed, and the sound was bright and brittle as breaking glass. "You misunderstand me entirely if you think this was ever about the debt. I could have found a dozen heiresses to pay that pittance, could have married into any family foolish enough to be dazzled by proximity to a dukedom. But Lady Eleanor is something special, isn't she? Something proud and unbroken that makes a man want to see just how far she'll bend before she shatters. And the fact that you want her, that you've been skulking around my bride to be like some lovesick gargoyle, well, that just makes the whole arrangement infinitely more satisfying." Gabriel felt something cold settle in his chest, the last ember of brotherly feeling finally extinguishing. "I won't allow it." Marcus rose from his chair, still smiling that terrible smile. "You won't allow it? And what exactly do you propose to do? Announce to the world that your monster's face isn't the only grotesque thing about our family? Drag us all through scandal because you've developed an infatuation with another man's property?" His voice dropped to something intimate, conspiratorial. "I know about your moonlit meetings, Gabriel. Servants talk, and I pay well for information. And if you interfere with this wedding, I will personally ensure that every drawing room in London hears how Lady Eleanor Ashworth spread her legs for both Blackwood brothers, how she seduced the scarred duke while betrothed to the handsome one, how she's nothing but a desperate whore from a bankrupt family trying to trade her way to a better bargain." The words hit like physical blows, and Gabriel felt his control carefully maintained for 5 years of isolation 5 years of swallowing rage and grief, and the burning need for justice finally crack, and before he could stop himself, his hands were fisted in Marcus's collar, hauling his brother close enough to see the genuine delight dancing in those cruel eyes, the satisfaction of having finally provoked the monster everyone believed Gabriel to be. "Touch me," Marcus whispered. "Strike me. Give me the bruises I need to prove you're exactly what you look like, and I'll have her reputation destroyed before you can draw your next breath. Your move, monster." Eleanor waited in the greenhouse where the orchids held their breath alongside her, where the glass walls had become her cathedral and the climbing roses her only congregation, and she counted the minutes by the trembling of her own hands until she heard footsteps on the gravel path, not the confident stride she had come to know, but something heavier, something broken. And when Gabriel appeared in the doorway, she saw defeat written across his features for the first time since she had known him, a crumbling of the quiet strength that had become her foundation, and she understood before he spoke a single word that Marcus had found a way to win. He told her everything in a voice stripped raw, the threats, the cruel calculation, the promise to destroy her reputation so thoroughly that no corner of society would receive her, and as he spoke, she watched him fold inward like a flower denied sunlight, watched him begin to believe that his intervention had only made things worse, that his love had become another weapon Marcus could wield against her. And something fierce rose up in Eleanor's chest, something that had been building since the first night. She wandered into a dark library and found a kindred soul hiding in the shadows. She crossed to him and took his face in her hands, both sides, the beautiful and the scarred, holding them with equal tenderness, and she made him look at her, truly look, until she saw the despair in his eyes meet the determination in hers. "Listen to me," she said, and her voice did not waver. "I would rather be ruined with you than saved without you. I would rather have society's scorn and your love than society's approval and Marcus's cruelty. Do you understand what I am telling you, Gabriel? Do you understand that you have not made things worse? That there was no version of this story where I emerged unscathed from a marriage to your brother? That the only question was ever whether I would face destruction alone or with someone who sees me, truly sees me, standing beside me?" He tried to speak, tried to protest, but she pressed her fingers gently against his lips and continued, and they sank down together onto the worn bench where they had spent so many stolen hours, surrounded by the impossible beauty he had coaxed from soil and shadow, and they talked as the night deepened around them, not of strategies or documents or legal technicalities, but of themselves, of fears so deep they had never been spoken aloud, of hopes so fragile they had been kept hidden even from their own hearts, of the children they might have someday, and the life they might build if only they were brave enough to reach for it. She told him about her mother's death, about the moment she realized her father saw her as currency rather than daughter, about the years of quiet suffocation that had preceded her arrival at Blackwood Manor, and he told her about the nights after the fire when he had wished the flames had finished their work, about learning to look at his reflection without flinching, about the slow resurrection of wanting to live that had begun the night. A desperate girl wandered into his library and spoke of emptiness. By the time dawn painted the glass walls gold and rose, Eleanor had made her decision with a clarity that felt like the first breath after nearly drowning, and she spoke it aloud so that the words became real, became irreversible. "I will not run, and I will not hide. I will walk into that church, and I will stand before Marcus and God and everyone who ever whispered about the poor Ashworth girl sold to pay her father's debts, and I will speak my truth, and whatever follows will follow. But I will not be silent, I will not be small, I will not let fear choose my future for me." The wedding morning arrived wrapped in autumn's coldest breath, the kind of day that seemed designed by fate itself to mirror the gravity of what was to come, and Eleanor stood motionless before her mirror as silent maids moved around her like ghosts, their fingers working mechanically at buttons and laces, while outside the window leaves fell from ancient oaks in spiraling descents that looked, she thought, with strange detachment, like tears the sky was too proud to weep. The white gown they dressed her in was beautiful, in the way a shroud is beautiful, all pale silk and delicate lace that someone had spent countless hours perfecting for a bride who would rather have worn mourning black, and when the final button was fastened and the veil arranged just so, the maid stepped back, and Eleanor regarded her reflection as though looking at a stranger, a porcelain doll fashioned in her image, serene and perfect, and utterly hollow. Her father arrived precisely on schedule, Lord Ashworth in his finest coat that she recognized as the last remnant of their former wealth, and he stood in the doorway, avoiding her eyes with the practiced skill of a man who had spent months perfecting the art of not seeing what his choices had wrought. His voice falsely bright as he recited platitudes about duty and family honor and the natural order of things, words that fell between them like stones into still water, creating ripples of silence that said far more than his empty reassurances ever could. "You look lovely, my dear, quite lovely. Your mother would be so proud to see you making such an advantageous match." And Eleanor did not trust herself to respond, did not trust what might emerge if she opened her mouth, so she simply took his arm when offered and allowed herself to be led downstairs and into the waiting carriage, like a lamb whose protests would change nothing about the altar that awaited. The church was filled to capacity with society's elite, rows upon rows of elegant spectators who had come not to celebrate love but to witness spectacle, to see the bankrupt Ashworth girl finally sold to the highest bidder, and Eleanor felt their eyes upon her as she paused in the doorway, curious eyes, pitying eyes, hungry eyes, eager for whatever drama might unfold, and at the altar stood Marcus in immaculate black, his handsome face arranged in an expression of triumph so poorly disguised as devotion that she wondered how anyone could fail to see the predator beneath the bridegroom's mask, and she began her measured walk down the aisle, each step precise and deliberate, her face composed into marble serenity, while beneath her bodice her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird, sensing an open window somewhere just out of reach, and her eyes, though she kept them fixed appropriately forward, searched the shadows of that ancient church, the dark corners where candles failed to penetrate, looking for a figure who might not come, who might have decided that scandal was too great a price, that she was not worth the destruction of everything he had rebuilt in his careful solitude. And the priest began his intonations in sonorous Latin, and the ceremony unfolded around her like a dream from which she could not wake, and she heard the words as though from a great distance, "Dearly beloved, gathered here, holy matrimony," and then, with terrible clarity, the question that hung in the incense-heavy air: "If anyone present knows of any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace." The silence that followed the priest's question stretched like a held breath, like the moment between lightning and thunder, and then the great oak doors at the back of the church burst open with a force that sent them crashing against the ancient stone walls, and every head in every pew turned as one toward the figure who strode down the aisle with the purposeful grace of a man who had finally stopped hiding from the world. And Eleanor's heart seized in her chest because there he was, Gabriel Blackwood, Duke of Ashworth, walking in full daylight with no cloak, no shadows, no concealment, his scarred face displayed for all to see, his shoulders squared with a dignity that made the gasps rippling through the congregation sound small and petty and utterly irrelevant, and she watched him approach as though watching a dream made manifest. This man who had spent 5 years in darkness, stepping into the light for her, because of her, and when he reached the altar, he did not flinch from the stares, did not turn his damaged cheek away from the hundreds of eyes that devoured his appearance with hungry curiosity, but instead stood tall and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of that hallowed space. "I object. This union is void, for the debt agreement upon which it was founded was made fraudulently, without my knowledge or consent, using accounts and authorities that belong solely to the Duke of Blackwood, which is to say, to me." Marcus's face transformed from triumph to rage in the span of a single heartbeat, his handsome features twisting into something ugly as he sputtered protestations and denials, but Gabriel simply reached into his coat and withdrew a sheaf of documents, which he presented to the priest with calm authority, legal proof of Marcus's deceptions, evidence of forged signatures and fabricated debts, a paper trail of lies that crumbled the foundation upon which this entire grotesque arrangement had been built. And as the priest examined the documents with widening eyes, as whispers erupted through the congregation like wildfire through dry grass, Gabriel turned to Eleanor with an expression so tender it made her eyes sting with tears she had forbidden herself to shed, and his voice, when he spoke again, was soft enough that only she and Marcus and the stunned priest could hear. "You are free, Eleanor, truly free, not because I have rescued you, but because the chains that held you were never legitimate, never binding. Never anything but the cruel invention of a cruel man. And what happens next is your choice alone, your decision, your future to write as you see fit. She looked at him standing there in the streaming light of stained glass windows, his scars illuminated in patterns of red and gold and blue. This man, who had emerged from his self-imposed exile and faced down his demons and risked everything, reputation, comfort, the careful isolation he had built around his wounded heart, and she did not hesitate, did not pause to consider what society would say or what scandals would follow, but simply stepped away from Marcus's side and took Gabriel's offered hand, feeling his fingers close around hers with a grip that trembled slightly despite his outward composure, and she spoke clearly enough for the entire congregation to hear. "I choose you." The scandal that erupted in the aftermath of Gabriel's revelation was not the scandal Marcus had intended to orchestrate, not the whispered condemnations of a fallen woman he had so confidently threatened, but rather a conflagration of truth that consumed his own, carefully constructed facade, and left nothing but ash and ruin in its wake. For the documents Gabriel had presented to the priest were only the beginning, and as the congregation sat in stunned silence, and Eleanor stood with her hand still clasped in Gabriel's, solicitors, who had been waiting at the church doors, entered with additional evidence of Marcus's crimes, ledgers showing years of embezzlement from the family accounts, forged letters bearing Gabriel's signature, authorizing debts the Duke had never approved, testimony from servants and tradesmen and fellow gamblers who had witnessed Marcus's deceptions and cruelties but had been too afraid to speak until now, and the assembled elite of society, those same people who had come expecting to witness the humiliation of a desperate girl sold to pay her father's debts, found themselves instead watching the unmasking of a monster who had walked among them for years, wearing the face of a charming gentleman, Lord Ashworth, confronted with the evidence of his complicity and the steady gaze of his daughter, who had nearly been sacrificed upon the altar of his weakness, finally found within himself some remnant of the man he had been before. Gambling and grief had hollowed him out, and he rose from his pew with trembling legs to confess his own role in the arrangement, how Marcus had preyed upon his desperation, how the debts had been inflated and manipulated, how he had convinced himself that Eleanor would be better off married to wealth, even if that wealth came wrapped in cruelty. And though his confession could not undo the harm he had caused, Eleanor watched him speak and felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of betrayal that had bound her since the day she first learned she had been bartered like livestock. Marcus, seeing the tide turn irrevocably against him, attempted to flee through the vestry door, but he found his path blocked by the very servants he had abused for years, men and women who had endured his rages and his casual violence, and who now stood shoulder to shoulder with quiet, implacable dignity, and within the hour he was taken into custody by magistrates, summoned by Gabriel's solicitors, his protests of innocence falling on ears that had heard too much truth to believe. Any more lies within days, he would flee to the continent on bail, posted by the last of his disreputable friends, escaping creditors and criminal charges alike, disappearing into an exile far less comfortable than the one Gabriel had chosen for himself. And then Gabriel turned to face the congregation, this man who had hidden for 5 years, who had believed his scars made him too monstrous for the world's gaze, and he spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of that sacred space. "I hid from the world because I believed my face made me a monster. I was wrong, for monstrosity lives in cruelty, not in flesh, and the true beast wore a handsome face while I cowered in shadows of my own making." Eleanor stood beside him as he spoke, her hand still in his, and when he finished, the congregation did something none of them expected. They applauded, softly at first, then with growing warmth, and Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she watched Gabriel's expression transform from braced resignation to wondering disbelief, as though he had prepared himself for rejection and found acceptance instead. And she thought that this was its own kind of miracle, this moment when the world chose compassion over judgment, when truth proved stronger than the lies that had held them all captive. Weeks passed into months, and the world that had seemed so fixed and immutable began to shift and reform itself around Eleanor and Gabriel like clay, taking new shape beneath patient hands for healing. They discovered together was not a single triumphant moment, but rather an accumulation of small choices, daily acts of courage that built upon one another until the impossible became possible, until the man who had hidden in shadows for 5 years found himself walking through the streets of London with his scarred face uncovered and his beloved's hand resting in the crook of his arm, and though he still noticed the stares, still caught the whispered comments and the quickly averted gazes, he no longer felt them as wounds but merely as weather, as passing clouds that could not dim the sun that Eleanor had become in his life, and she, in turn, channeled all the dreams she had once pressed between the pages of her journal into tangible reality, working alongside Gabriel's groundskeepers and gardeners to transform his hidden greenhouse into something magnificent, a proper botanical garden that opened its gates to scholars and students and curious visitors who came from across the country to see the rare orchids and exotic specimens that thrived under glass and careful tending. And when she walked among the beds, explaining the Latin names and the countries of origin and the particular requirements of each delicate bloom, Gabriel would watch from a distance with an expression that made the servants smile and exchange knowing glances, for they had never seen their master look at anything the way he looked at her, as though she were herself a rare flower that he could scarcely believe had chosen to bloom in his garden. Lord Ashworth came to Blackwood Manor 3 times that winter, each visit an attempt at reconciliation that cost Eleanor more than she allowed herself to show for forgiveness. She was learning was not a single decision but a practice, a discipline that required her to set down the weight of betrayal again and again. Each time she instinctively picked it back up, and on his 3rd visit, when her father sat across from her in the morning room with his hands trembling around his teacup and his eyes red-rimmed with the tears of a man who has finally allowed himself to see clearly the wreckage he has made of his life, his daughter's trust, Eleanor spoke the words she had been turning over in her heart for months. "I forgive you, Father, because carrying hatred would poison the life I am building, and you have already taken enough from me without taking my peace as well, but I will never forget, and I will never again allow myself to be currency in any man's ledger, not yours, not anyone's. And if you wish to be part of my future, then you must understand that the daughter you bartered away in that study is gone, and the woman before you now will set her own terms." Gabriel, who had been standing quietly by the window throughout this exchange, felt his heart swell with something that transcended pride. It was awe. He realized pure and humbling awe at the woman Eleanor had become, or perhaps had always been beneath the desperation and fear, this woman of backbone and grace who could extend mercy without surrendering her dignity, who could honor the father who had failed her while refusing ever again to be failed in the same way. And when Lord Ashworth departed that afternoon, diminished but not destroyed, Gabriel took Eleanor's hands in his own and told her that she was the bravest person he had ever known, braver than himself by far. And she laughed and kissed him and said that courage, like flowers, grew best when it had good soil and patient tending, and he had given her both. Spring arrived at Blackwood Manor not as a sudden transformation but as a gentle insistence, the way hope itself often comes first, in the tentative green shoots, pushing through soil still cold from winter's grip, then in the swelling buds that appeared on branches that had seemed dead only weeks before, and finally in the full glorious riot of blossoms that covered the gardens and orchards and wild meadows surrounding the estate, as though the land itself had decided to celebrate what was to come. And on a morning in late April, when the restored greenhouse stood filled with flowers from 4 continents, and sunlight streamed through the glass panels to cast prismatic rainbows across the stone pathways, Eleanor Ashworth walked toward Gabriel Blackwood to become his wife in a ceremony that bore no resemblance to the spectacle that had been planned for her in that cold autumn church, for there were no society elite crowding the pews in silks and judgment, no whispered speculation about the bride's desperation or the groom's disfigurement, no sense of transaction or obligation or debt being settled instead. The greenhouse held only those who had earned their place through love and loyalty. The 6 servants Gabriel had carried from the flames 5 years ago, standing now with their families, their faces bright with joy for the master who had given them their lives. The scholars and botanists who had become Eleanor's colleagues and friends during the months she had spent building her garden, a handful of relations from both families who had proven themselves worthy of witness through their actions rather than their blood, and Eleanor's father, seated quietly at the back, present but not prominent. His invitation, a gift of grace that had cost Eleanor more than anyone but Gabriel would ever know. She wore no elaborate gown of imported silk, no suffocating corset or cascading train instead. She had chosen a simple dress of cream-colored muslin that moved when she moved, that allowed her to breathe and walk and feel the warm earth beneath her thin slippers, and in her hair she had woven flowers from Gabriel's greenhouse, orchids and roses and jasmine that perfumed the air around her with sweetness as she made her way down the pathway between the flowering beds. And when she reached the place where Gabriel stood, waiting, his scarred face fully visible in the streaming sunlight, his eyes never leaving hers, his hands steady despite the emotion, she could see trembling at the corners of his mouth. She felt no fear, no resignation, no sense of fate closing around her like a trap, only the profound rightness of choosing and being chosen, of standing in the light with all their imperfections exposed and finding acceptance rather than judgment. Their vows were simple words spoken quietly, meant not for performance but for each other alone, and when Eleanor said, "I choose you," she heard the echo of that moment in the church when she had taken his hand before all of society and claimed him as her own. And she understood now that love was not a single dramatic gesture, but an accumulation of choices made again and again, each day, each moment, the constant turning toward another person, even when turning away would be easier. And Gabriel, whose rare smiles had become less rare in the month since their first wedding that wasn't, smiled now with such unguarded joy that several of the servants wiped tears from their eyes, and he said, "I choose you, in light and shadow, always," and slid onto her finger a ring set with a stone the color of spring leaves, and Eleanor thought that she had never truly understood happiness until this moment, standing in a greenhouse full of flowers with sunlight on her face, and the man she loved, holding her hands as though she were the most precious bloom in all his collection. 3 years had passed since that spring wedding in the greenhouse, 3 years of seasons, turning and love deepening, and life unfolding in ways that Eleanor could never have imagined during those dark days when she had stood in her dying garden at Ashworth House and believed her future held nothing but emptiness and endurance. And now, on a golden afternoon in late summer, she stood in the doorway of the nursery at Blackwood Manor and watched her husband kneel beside their daughter's bed, the sunlight streaming through the window to illuminate them both, and she felt her heart so full that she wondered how it could possibly contain such abundance without breaking from the weight of joy. The botanical garden had become famous throughout England and beyond, drawing scholars and students and curious visitors who came to marvel at the rare orchids and exotic specimens that flourished under Eleanor's expert care, and she had published 3 papers in prestigious scientific journals, her name spoken with respect in circles that had once dismissed her as nothing more than a desperate girl sold to pay her father's debts. But none of those accomplishments filled her with pride the way this moment did, watching Gabriel trace his finger along the illustrated pages of a flower book, while their daughter, Charlotte, reached up with wondering fingers to touch the scars that mapped his face, and instead of flinching or turning away, as he would have done 4 years ago, he simply smiled and told her that his scars were maps of love, proof that he would walk through fire for those he cherished. And Charlotte, who had her mother's curiosity and her father's gentle soul, nodded solemnly and said that she thought they were beautiful, and Eleanor had to press her hand to her mouth to contain the sound that rose in her throat, something between laughter and tears, because she remembered so clearly the man who had hidden in shadows, believing himself monstrous, and she saw now the father who wore his scars in sunlight as badges of courage rather than marks of shame. Gabriel looked up and caught her watching from the doorway, and the smile he gave her, still rare enough to feel like a gift, still beautiful enough to steal her breath, held within it all the gratitude of a man who had been given back his life by love, and Eleanor crossed the room to join them, settling onto the edge of the bed as Charlotte demanded that her mother identify the flowers in the book, and for a long while the 3 of them existed in perfect contentment, naming blossoms and laughing at Charlotte's mispronunciations, and simply being together in the way that families are together when they have chosen each other, not from obligation, but from love. Dear listener, perhaps you too have felt promised to something cruel, a fate, a fear, a future that seemed as inescapable as the walls of a crumbling estate or the bars of a gilded cage. Perhaps you have hidden your scars in shadows, believing they made you unworthy of love, undeserving of light, destined for isolation rather than connection. But remember this truth, that Eleanor and Gabriel discovered through patience and courage, and the accumulated weight of small choices made again and again. The altar of your life is not sealed until you say, "I do," And sometimes the truest love arrives not as rescue from without, but as courage from within. The courage to step into the light with all your imperfections exposed, to speak your truth even when your voice trembles, to choose differently even when the world insists your fate is fixed. May you find your garden in the shadows. May you tend it with patience. May you watch it bloom against all expectation. And may you know in your deepest heart that you are worthy of spring, worthy of sunlight, worthy of being chosen, not despite your scars but alongside them, as part of the full and beautiful truth of who you are. Rest well, dear heart, and dream of open doors.